So the show is called The History of Something.
Yeah.
Why did you leave it open in that way? Because that's pretty big, the
Yeah,
history
that's
of
very.
something.
It's a very broad topic. So as I was saying earlier, especially in some elementary schools, the one that I went to in my latter half, science, especially STEM, is considered higher than humanities and arts
Mm.
and honestly, writing too. So back then, if you were like a science whiz or a math whiz, you were like smart, you were popular in that sense. And for the while, I didn't think anything was wrong until I went into middle school. And now middle school is very different than elementary schools because
Mm-hmm.
there's people from all other schools, right? And
Mm.
some other schools don't really focus on science and math that much, and they have like excellent writers, excellent people at history, and really people good at arts. And now, as I'm making this show, I first thought, how about we do this in science so I can inspire kids to love science? But then, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this would just be playing to the agenda that STEM is better than like someone who's great at STEM is
Oh, I
superior than
see.
someone great at that
Mm-hmm.
at like arts or something.
Yeah.
So that's why I named it as history of something because I want kids to keep an open mind to what each subject can be,
Mm-hmm.
and I want them to really appreciate that. Hey, STEM is great and all, but being creative, being excellent in
Sure.
arts is also a really good skill. Someone who's good at drawing should hold the same type of caliber to someone who's really good at math.
It's a really interesting idea because I feel like when you go to school and or even in just some of the other educational programming that you see, it is very compartmentalized. It's very
Yeah.
like you have your math, you have your science, you have your arts, and each one of those things is in a really completely separate sphere from the
Yeah.
other.
And in all reality, that could be no more further from the truth. All of these are really interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
Arts are in the sciences, and sciences are present in all types of art. And I think that if kids learn to appreciate all of these subjects at a really young age, first of all, I think they'll be open to making more logical and creative decisions.
Mm.
And also, I think they'll just be more they'll respect each subject more. Have you ever wondered who's on the $100 bill? Who conducted the famous kite experiment all those years ago? In the inaugural episode of The History of Something, I'll be covering Benjamin Franklin. He was one of the most influential and famous founding fathers of America. I'll give some context so you know where this takes place in history. Benjamin Franklin was born on January 17th, 1706 in Boston. At this time, Britain still ruled over the 13 colonies, which you are probably learning about in school. Ben lived during this period, and he was the 14th out of 16 kids his parents had. They were not particularly wealthy. However, he did live in a relatively kind household. It's crazy to think that the 14th child could accomplish such great feats in his life. This episode will be divided into 4 parts. The first is when Ben's a little kid. The second is when he's an apprentice for his brother. The third part is when he's a young adult. And the final part is when he becomes a politician and a founding father. Ben had an immense love for reading, which you will learn about later, and I suggest that anyone who loves this episode should read the Value Tales. This series was inspired by it. My dad used to read these to me when I was younger, and they really catalyzed my love for science and the humanities. But enough of the introduction, let's jump right into the incredible life of Benjamin Franklin. In a not so far away land, not so long ago, lived a bright man who tried his hands at everything that he could, and most importantly, he tried to save everything that he could. His name was Benjamin Franklin. Ben at his father's candle shop when he was younger.
Hello, father. I cannot see myself working at your candle shop when I'm older. Even though we could only afford to send me to 2 years to Boston Latin, I love to read and would really like to do something in that field. Ben, you could take up a position in church. That is a very respectable position, and you'd get to work with the Bible. I can clearly see that being a candle maker is not the correct path for you. No, father, I do not think becoming a priest would be something that I'd like to do. Hmm. Well, how about you become an apprentice for your brother James? That way you can get a head start on printing and maybe later do something with books. Very well, father. I shall do as such.
Back in those days, it was very common for young boys to become apprentices to learn the skills required for certain able to keep their houses warm. Tensions with the crown are at an all-time high, and you're getting harassed by the English soldiers. People wanted a change, and they wanted an independent nation. You have to choose some people to make very big and some very important decisions. Who do you pick? Well, you pick Benjamin Franklin, of course. Because of his ingenuity, he won over the hearts of many people who would lead the nation. The nation needed to create a formal draft of independence, which is what our Independence Day is named for. On July 4th, 1776, our nation formally ratified off the Declaration of Independence, and you can bet that Benjamin Franklin's name was one of the first ones on it. Unfortunately, Britain did not want to let the United States of America have their independence peacefully, and then the War of Independence took place. As the United States was still a very, very, very young nation, they needed all the help they could get, and so they sent Ben to France to negotiate to see if France would send their soldiers and generals in a fight against Britain. He first got elected into a General Council Assembly in Philadelphia because of his hard work and the popularity that he had with the people in his town. He was able to get into this assembly because he worked as a clerk in 1736, which made him all the more welcome to get elected. Alongside of this, his contributions to the people of Philadelphia made him a prime delegate to draft the Declaration of Independence. In the colonial time period, the first few years of war were almost always the most critical ones. That's where you would get your allies or lose your allies. Ben had been sent to France by the delegation to make sure that he could recruit people from the French Republic Army. The French had a vested interest in this as they were always trying to defeat the arch nemesis Britain.
Monsieur Franklin, I will only commit to helping the United States of America if and when you are able to win a major battle against the British. As of now, you've been getting demolished on all the fronts, and I simply cannot throw my men out there if you do not give a good result on your own.
Ben was under a significant amount of stress as he was responsible for either bringing in an ally or losing them. On the outside, however, he tried his best to be as charming and as Benjamin-like as possible. He grew immensely popular with the French, and along with the victory at Saratoga, he was able to gain support of the King's army and a general we know today as Marquis de Lafayette. In addition to all of this, he was able to become the first ambassador to the French and more broadly Europe as a whole. His house in France became the center of relations between the Americans and the Europeans. The Tale of the Compassionate Doctor. Once upon a time in the world, colonies were commonplace. Especially in Africa, European countries would own the African countries and take all of the resources that that African country had. That left those countries severely underdeveloped, and unfortunately, many of those countries have not been able to recover from centuries of exploitation. Underdeveloped means a country that has not been urbanized, which means it does not have big buildings or big cities. In the olden days, in the forests of Africa, there were many types of diseases, insects, and other disease carriers that made people very sick. They had no doctors, hospitals, and many died as they could not get any care. But this is where our friend Albert Schweitzer is known to come in and save the day. Albert Schweitzer is known all over the world as the doctor who helped the African people in the 1900s. He is known as the doctor who went out of his way to help a nation that was struggling with various diseases such as malaria and dengue. His humanitarian efforts throughout his life earned him one of the highest awards in humanity, the Nobel Peace Prize. Just like the last episode, we will be dividing his life up into 4 parts. The first was when he was a young boy. The second was when he was an adult conducting his training in medicine and his assignment to Gabon. The third part will be his hospital era until World War I. And the fourth part will be from the end of the First World War to the end of Albert's life. Once again, this story is inspired by the Valley Tales, the series of books that catalyzed my love for science and the humanities. But enough of this introduction, let's jump right into the spellbound life of Albert Schweitzer. Let's time travel back to Kaiserberg, the place where Albert was born. Albert Schweitzer was born on January 14, 1875, in the town of Kaiserberg, which was then part of Germany. It is part of France today. He was a frail young boy when he was born. His mother was determined that he would grow up strong, and she took such good care of him that by the time he was 2, he was as strong and as sturdy as any other toddler. So much so that for all his life after that, he would be capable of remarkable and prolonged excursions. As a kid, Albert loved music, especially the organ. Not much else is known about Albert's childhood, partly because of how unspecial it was. He was much like any other boy who was music-driven at the time, and compared to his adult self, his childhood was quite ordinary. As he went of Gabon, a place filled with so much greenery that any buildings have to be built on stilts to prevent them from being eaten up by the jungle. Now, one might ask how Albert traveled to Africa. He first boarded a steamboat from Germany all the way to Gabon. Afterwards, they used massive canoes to travel from the entrance of Gabon to the isolated town of Lambaréné. This basically means diseases that are carried through dirty, unhygienic water. People in that time in Gabon used to drink the river water, which was not clean and caused them a lot of illnesses. Unfortunately, in Africa, there was nothing Albert could do to prevent these types of diseases, as he could treat people, and as soon as he treated them, they would go back to drinking the dirty water, as there was nothing else that they had to drink. Little did they know that they would get a big helping hand and a lifelong friend in a couple of days. One day, a former patient named Joseph Azawami came in and in fluent French offered to help Albert. Albert was ecstatic with having a helper, and as we said before, this would eventually turn into a lifelong friendship. Ever since the early Roman times, flight has always been something mankind has dreamt about. The ancient Greeks would see birds fly and wonder, why can't we fly too? They would investigate this phenomenon to the extent that they would make a whole myth about it. In the beginning, it wasn't just the Greeks who were fascinated by flight, as a Chinese emperor tried to reach the moon by putting hundreds and hundreds of fireworks underneath his throne. We all know that will not go well. The principle of flight itself is very simple. Birds do it, so how hard could it be? Well, the simple action that a bird does turned out to need hundreds and hundreds of years through countless different scientists, researchers, and inventors to finally become a reality for humans. Now, you might know who finally developed the plane, but not many people know about the others who slowly helped the principle and idea of a plane to take form throughout the years. Who first documented flight? Who made the first plausible sketches of a plane? What were some attempts before the Wright brothers, and why did they not work? How did the Wright brothers finally make their first airplane? These are all questions that we will answer in today's episode of The History of Something. Today's episode will be divided into 4 parts as usual. The first part will be about the early days and their visions of flight and some ideas that they might have had. The second part will be covering the medieval period, mainly Da Vinci. The third part will be covering the golden age of science from the 1700s to the 1900s and what really played into making a plane. And the last part will be about the famous Wright brothers and their final push to create the airplane. This is not inspired by the Valley Tales. However, I highly recommend that you read the series. But enough of this introduction, let's jump right into the twisting story of flight. The Greeks were like no other ancient civilization in Europe. They were curious about everything and how it worked. Often, to represent these questions and curiosities, they would model them in the form of myths. The myth of Icarus is about a father and a son who are stranded on Crete, which is a Greek island, and they have to use wax wings to fly out. I won't get into the specifications of the myth in today's episode, but for our purposes, this is the first account that we have of the conception of flight. The next time flight is revisited is with the great Da Vinci nearly 1,000 years later. Most of us know Leonardo da Vinci because of his artwork, primarily the Mona Lisa. However, he has explored almost every corner of humanity.
I was one of the most curious people of my time. I love to identify and explore many tangential topics such as optics, anatomy, astronomy, and mechanics. When I was trying to build my version of the airplane, the only thing I had to model it with were birds. That's why I made the ornithopter.
This ornithopter was something that was hundreds of years ahead of its time. Da Vinci had taken the painstaking time to analyze the bone and muscle structures of birds and proceed to draw intricate drawings of the possible ornithopter that was based off of these. As we can see in the diagram, it would work by having the person flap the two big wings with his arms, and Da Vinci had been smart enough to make sure to give the ornithopter a backbone to make sure that it was stable, which is a vital concept that we will revisit in 400 years. Finally, we come out the Wright brothers. These are the brothers who finally made the airplane. Orville and Wilbur Wright were born in the years 1871 and 1876, respectively, in Dayton, Ohio. There were 2 out of the 7 siblings that their parents had, training in them. The brothers settled in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to do their aviation-related activities due to 2 reasons. Firstly, the steady breeze that was present, and the soft sand that their gliders and planes could land in. I think we should add the curve to our double-decker design of the glider to make it safer for us and easier to control.
Sure, Orville, I think that is a great idea. However, I do not want you to get hurt, and I will do the gliding for the first couple of years.
Their first couple of glides were all similar in the flight map. They would range from 5 seconds all the way to 26. And usually they would cover around 500 feet. Some of the problems that they had were that the plane was not going as high as they imagined, and they later realized the lift equation that they had gotten from Langley was slightly incorrect and required modifications based on the location that these tests were taking place. Most importantly, however, they were able to turn the plane continuously and with ease. This was something that had not been done before. They were able to perfect the 3 axes of movement: wing warping for a roll, a forward elevator for pitch, and a rear rudder for yaw. Their 1902 glider was the final glider that they would use, and all they had to do was to power it.